So talk to me about rights of light. Why why should anyone really care about it? I know why you need to do it, and it's a pain for lots of people. And I know that when people come and ask us to do it in my consultancy,
Yeah.
they they come kind of dragging their heels. I'm sure that you don't experience that, do you? Okay. So so
They come with open arms. Yeah. Yeah.
so why should anyone really care about it?
Yeah. Darren, you're spot on because it is the pain that people don't want to deal with. It's the last thing on the list a lot of the times, or historically it has been, where no one thinks it's ever really going to amount to anything. It's another cost upfront and long term if you're thinking about insurance, or, negotiations with people or whatever the avenue takes you down, but it's a cost, and it's a cost that isn't necessarily something that people factor in. And even if they do factor it in, they want it as low as possible so that it doesn't impinge on maybe a funder's balance sheet and things like that. So yes, you're right about the heel drag. Some clients are great, some clients know about it, and they're the ones that we work with and the ones that we've been able to sort of explain to and get their buy-in of, oh, actually, let's look at this at the start because it's going to be important later. So to answer the first question, why should anyone care? Well, the risk is still there. The risk is real. Things like this can go to court and really slow down your development program. Worst case, they can mean that you might have to knock down your building and start again. Best case, you might have to get some insurance and not worry about it, although that market is probably changing based on the latest case that's come through. But they should care because it's not something that needs to be done. And a lot of the time, the funder for a project or even a purchaser further down the line is going to want to know, is that rights of light done and dusted, or where's it up to? Has anyone thought about it? Has anyone looked at it at an early stage? Because if they haven't, you're talking about bailing things out from the back end, which is never really where you want to be. You want to be upfront, knowing your costs and understanding where your risk is. So that's why it's important.
So just talk just very briefly about what rights of light is for someone listening or watching that doesn't really understand it. They've heard of it, but they don't really understand it.
Yeah.
Could you summarize it?
Yeah. In summary, it's an old English law that is still around today. It's something that in its purest form is about a window receiving light. And if you're going to put a new building in front of that window or nearby or across the street, if you're going to reduce that amount of light that's currently going in, then there's a certain level that is deemed legally acceptable. And it's quite an old style of measurement. It's nothing modern, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. But in short, if it goes below that reasonable, acceptable level, that is when that owner can approach the developer and say, look, not happy with this. You're going to reduce my light beyond this certain level. Therefore, I'm either going to take you to court, seek damages, or maybe we can have a chat off record and see if we can work something out. In short, it's a reduction in light for buildings surrounding a development.
So if I own those buildings around that development, is that still applicable for me?
Depends. So it will depend on the ownership structure. If you've put some leases in place and you have granted all rights to those leaseholders, and they may be able to demonstrate their own rights. And if they're long leases, hundreds of years into the future, where your interest down is actually only 200 years away, well, it's an interesting concept if you already own them, because you might say, well, look, I'm the ultimate freeholder. I already own it. I can't affect myself. That would be the base position. You have to have two separate owners. It would be quite complicated and interesting if it was a lease in that situation. You would probably draft a lease to say, I can do what I want on my retained land. But yeah, in short, you have to have two separate owners. So you couldn't claim against yourself. And if they had the rights themselves, well, yeah, that would be one for the lawyers to get into.
Can you just explain the difference between rights to light and the daylight legislation that comes from planning?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a key question, as one we get asked all the time when we're doing CPDs and things like that. So rights of light, as we've just gone through, That's your legal bit. That's the piece that's going to get you in with the lawyers, and you're going to have to do a bit of search, and that's that legal right piece. The daylight and sunlight piece is about planning, and it constitutes different types of analysis, different testing. It's a different form and a different way of looking at daylight and how that reaches into neighboring buildings and buildings that you are designing brand new. So effectively, on one hand, so let's say the left-hand side is rights of light, and that's your legal piece, and the right-hand side would be the daylight and sunlight and things that feed into BRE guidelines and more. I see these as more human. These are easier generally to understand than the rights of light piece, because there isn't really a legal element in there. It's more of a lived experience of, that's the light in my room. I understand, we're all human. We see the light coming through the windows and we kind of get it. It's a bit more in touch with everyone's day-to-day lived experience. So the interesting thing is both of those can run at the same time. And you can be, if you're a developer, you're looking at the rights of light for the legal piece, but you're also working with your planning consultant and your design team to balance the daylight and sunlight piece.
Because what you can have is you can have the building pass and be approved by the planners, but then still give yourself a legal problem if you've not got the rights.
Exactly right, Dan. You can be, and this is again a common mistake. We're seeing it less these days because people are more informed, thanks to people like ourselves and yourself of telling people this stuff and educating everybody. But typically you might have seen someone who gets a planning permission and thinks, great, done and dusted, and that rights of light thing, that's sorted because the planning will always trump that. Well, that's not the case. You can end up with a great scheme on planning and on paper, and the council can love it, and you might even receive no objections. But you might receive a nice letter from someone in, the house down the road that says, actually, I'm concerned about this right here. And that's another point, actually. Daylight and sunlight is generally to do with impacts on residential properties. Doesn't really always fall into non-residential uses. There's a couple of things like maybe hospital or a school if there's a certain need for it, but generally it's sticking with the resi stuff. Rights of light can apply to pretty much any building. And any part of a building, really. You might have a commercial office space and you might have a back staircase with some windows to it. And if there's a rights of light injury there, well, yeah, that's an injury and that needs to be dealt with. Whereas the daylight and sunlight piece doesn't really, even if a residential property is affected in daylight and sunlight terms, if that effect is in a staircase or maybe a back toilet, it's not really as important, or it's not viewed as, in terms of the guidance, as something as strong as maybe a rights of light position might be.
So let's get into the weeds now with the law. What does the law say that you need to have? What is acceptable? What's not acceptable? And then you made reference to a case that was in the courts fairly recently, and just go into detail about what that was all about.
Well, I should have brought a lawyer with me. The interesting thing with rights of light is it does drip through law, or there's almost everything you touch, really, you could easily get a lawyer to look at, really. There's a surveying element and there's a legal element. In terms of what light you need, that's probably slightly more on the surveying side, and in its simplest form, this adequate level was devised over 100 years ago by this chap called Percy Waldron and his dad. And they looked at the total amount of sky that you might see if you were in a field, completely open sky, and then what you might see if you are in a building and from a vertical window, what can you actually see out? Okay, so it's probably about half, maybe even slightly less than that complete sky. And then from there, they sort of derived what you really need, what you actually need as a human to be reading the paper or doing some work at a desk. Now, don't forget, this is over 100 years ago. This is sort of 1920s, and generally you're in and around London. It's quite an interesting fact that we still use this methodology today, because the world has changed massively. And in short, the easiest way of thinking about the measurement that you need is it's 1 candle per square foot, or 1 foot candle, to be able to read your paper or to be able to do your notes and things like that. So it's this very historic measurement that isn't really applicable today. So that's what we're still working with. That's where the legal line is. Then that's the first element. The second element is how much of each room deserves or should have that amount of light. So if you had a big room, and let's say it's 100 square feet back from the window, effectively 50% of that, or 50 square feet, should have 1 candle per square foot across that surface area. And if it dips below that because of a new development over the road, that's when you've got your problem, your injunction risk, your negotiation, whatever it is. That's the cutoff point. And that is, again, pretty malleable. That is an easy yardstick and a rule of thumb to work by, which is still used in the courts today because it presents quite a black and white scenario. Is it more than 50% of the room that's being reduced beyond that level? Yes, no. Okay, great. And then everybody moves forward because it makes it a lot easier. In reality, even that old type of analysis is nuanced. But that's where we're at. Legally, there's lots of cases over the years that have played into this. Effectively, it's a right of light case will hinge on whether it's a nuisance, and it's about whether a nuisance has occurred, and it's about the tort of nuisance. Has the owner of that neighbouring property that they're sitting in, have they been caused a nuisance and inconvenience by that neighbouring property just in terms of the light? The measurement is just a way to benchmark that. Yeah, right. So it's about that nuisance. And now some of those cases that we refer to, they're not even about rights of light. They're more about nuisance or noise because they set a precedent. So we, as a community of rights of light surveyors and everyone in the field and legal professionals, we all get a bit excited when there's a new case because it takes about 5 to 10 years sometimes between cases. A lot gets settled pre-court proceedings, really. A lot of people want to take it right to the edge, and then they'll settle with a developer because actually they're just trying to, maybe they're trying to extract money from the situation. Maybe they're trying to frustrate a developer until something else happens. There's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't ever get to the court. Maybe they don't have a strong position, and maybe they're just trying it on. And other times, the developer really does need to pay attention and really get into a good negotiation. The Bankside Lofts or Bankside Yards case that happened over the last sort of 2 or 3 months, well, that was when it was getting decided, and that's when it was in the courts. It's interesting because mainly about the methods of assessment. So we've talked about this old method of assessment and these candles and all this kind of stuff. It's obviously all done on computers now, and that's how the things work. But it's still quite an archaic method, and we're still doing this yes-no methodology. What happened in that case is the surveyor was effectively trying to show, well, look, we're in the 21st century. And if you remember the daylight and sunlight stuff we were talking about before, that's measured using a completely different set of software. That's measured using BRE methodology, the Building Research Establishment, and they've got, scientists who've been working on this type of stuff for years. Last 30, 40 years, people have been developing these methods alongside all the other great stuff they do. Now, we've got all this amazing science and evidence. Well, surely we must be able to measure this in a more modern way. One tricky thing is that's never really been tested through the courts. It's been mentioned, maybe use the new analysis combined with the old one, or what tends to happen is it's either or, because this is either good for the developer or bad, and same on the modern side. So the surveyor on that side, on that case, was very much trying to say, well, look, actually, there's all these modern methods. These are a bit more sensible, perhaps, and at least please consider them. And why can't we use them? It does this to the light. It shows that it moves in this way, and it's more realistic. It takes into account reflected light. The old method, it's pretty plain. It's whether there's some light in the sky outside or not. The new method is, again, like I say, a bit more of a lived experience piece. So that's why this case has been so interesting, because it's the first one that's really brought to light, pardon the pun, that there is a modern set of methods. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is the community and the people in the field really hang the hat and wait on this judgment. And in the end, the judgment is a bit more minded to keep using the old method, because it's so much easier for a layperson to understand, is there a problem, yes or no, rather than, let's have a look at this diagram. There's lots of factors, there's lots of variables in these analyses. And that's where, as an industry, we're at now. There is the need to agree between surveyors, really, where we're at and what we want to use to make a measurement. If we keep waiting until there's a court decision, that could also be inhibit our judgment. So if this judgment had been different and said, right, okay, use this modern method, well, everyone would have had to suddenly flip to use the modern one. So to us and my peers and my colleagues who I've been talking to, it seems to make sense that we get together as an industry and actually figure it out on our own, decide, look, we think we should probably all start trying to use this, or maybe we could try it like this, because otherwise I think we're just going to keep waiting and nothing will really change. We'll wait for another 5-10 years for a case and we'll be in the same bracket, or there'll be a case that is really prescriptive and says, don't ever use this and only use the old one, or vice versa. So that's why it's been quite an interesting one to watch.
And that really just comes down to the judge, doesn't it? The judge is understanding because it's the judge that sets the precedent at that time. But the judge obviously is going to be au fait with the law as it's been taught to them, as opposed to the research and the new methodology from the BRE, because we understand light now far better than what we did 100 years ago.
Exactly, yeah.
We understand that light is a wave and also a particle. I don't know that we quite understood it back then, did we? I mean,
not to the same degree, surely not. The simple premise was probably there, but I just think it boggles my mind how much technology and research is in these things these days. And let's not forget about this is another field entirely, but electric light is used in a very different way these days, and it's not as harsh as it used to be. You can change the colors. You can do lots of things with electric light, and a lot of, for example, apartments are designed with that in mind. If you've got task bar of a kitchen, like a task bench, you're going to have under unit lighting, which is going to be soft and it's going to help you do your tasks at the kitchen. A lot of the old methodology says, right, well, your kitchen needs to be designed so it's right in front of the window. Well, not necessarily in an inner city apartment. So there's so much research that's gone into stuff, but you're absolutely right, Darren. A judge is going to say, well, actually, for the last 100 or so years, how have people measured this? Okay, seems pretty reasonable to keep using this method because, yeah, it still gives me a nice yes or no, and I can judge it based on what I think is reasonable. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, but I think for us, the idea is to try and move the dial without just waiting until something happens, because I think if we do that, we just end up stalling for honestly the next 20 years.
So coming together definitely as an industry to make that decision is something I'm a big fan of.
Yeah.
The reason I'm a fan of it is because you're exercising your agency and your ability to act instead of having to react to something that someone else has made a decision on. And then I think there's more chaos by doing it that way.
Well, you can see it in the slightly outside of my field, but certainly something that Hollis look at all the time, and I come across it all the time just through my work with developers, is the Building Safety Act stuff. And the regulatory body's been set up. No one's quite sure how it's all going to work on day one, but there it is. It's ready to go. And then people are having trouble with it because everybody's having to react rather than go, okay, how are we going to do that? It's getting a lot better. Talking to our clients, we know that it is getting better. The regulation and the regulatory body is got more staff and it's got more people trained up, but that is that moment when you flip a switch and everybody has to react, and it's a scramble, and we are trying to avoid the scramble rather than having to all jump into it.
It reminds me, and this is kind of a childish way of looking at it, to be honest, but maybe this is just where my mind's at the moment. But do you remember at school, someone would come in with a big bag of sweets and they'd shout scrambles? Did you have that where you were growing up?
Yeah.
And they'd throw the sweets in the air and there'd just be bedlam for ages.
Yeah.
And it's like, and that's what it is like most of the time, where it's like, I just need to get myself in the best position possible, get the best resources behind me. I don't care what else is going on with anyone else. Just need to look after my own interests. So although it's a childish example, and most adults have been there when they were children, I think we still act as adults in that way when it comes to this type of legislation.
I think that's a great analogy, and yeah, it appeals to my sweet tooth as well. So I always have the biggest pile. But yeah, it's absolutely right. you end up looking after your own interest. And okay, that might mean that you're looking after your client's interest, great, but maybe just in that one silo, and that's not really helping yourself or helping the client. And, the world I work in, it's quite a small industry. We know each other, we know the other surveyors, and we all work together. There are already some industry groups who work together to think about new standards or ways of working, which is great. So this is why these types of things need to be involved in those conversations.
What are some of the common pitfalls that architects experience with regards to this topic?
Yeah, we always we love working with architects
Yeah.
because we get to start at the ground level basically. In most situations, we get to start with a flat site or an empty site, and the architects are working with us, and we're working with them to try and figure out, wow, well, what's the best massing? Now, I look back to my time when I first started in this world, sort of, around 10 years ago. And I think, wow, we used to do pretty much for every job, like an envelope study for a jelly mold study for the architects and for the client to say, well, actually, look, you can build up to this high and keep your building within this. And maybe you can poke out here and here and it should be fine, but we'll rerun that when you've got the massing. That was a really great way of working. What has changed over the last few years is that those massings that will fit in the jelly mold and the jelly mold, sorry, to start again, that is giving you your rights of light and daylight in one jelly mold to say, actually, if you go outside of these, you might sort of see some problems. If you stay inside, you're all good. You're not going to cause any problems. Now, what's happened over the last few years is those jelly molds don't really align with viable development because development costs have gone astronomical, and everyone has this really funny view of developers when they're not working in construction or in property, that these developers are sitting there on an ivory tower with tons of cash and they're just building it all the time. I don't think that that's the case. The developers' margins are even thinner than they ever were, and if they were to build within those sort of safe envelopes, they're just not going to get the returns. So it does come down to money a little bit. So we can still use those envelopes in some cases, and some sites are great for it. Others, we've had to adapt and work with the architects to figure out where maybe different plots or different buildings might be able to move, or maybe different pieces of massing. So effectively, it's gone from a more widespread, here's your site, you can roughly build within this jelly mold, to more specific of, look, let's try that block there and let's put that one there. Our analysis is going to say X, Y, and Z. Therefore, maybe you can put some massing there. I'd say where not many architects fall down on this, really. They're all very keenly aware that they need to adhere to these things as well. And I really feel sorry for architects because they have so many things that they have to adhere to. They've got all different stakeholders sort of in their ears, and the last thing they need is me calling them up and saying, right, okay, you poked out the envelope there, so what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't feel too sorry for them because they knew what they signed up to when they decided to go to architectural school.
Yeah.
So it's part of the complexity, isn't it, of being an architect?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that they're very keenly aware of the daylight stuff, maybe more so the daylight, because that's where I feel like they start, because that is the planning piece, and that gets them through the planning with the client and the planning consultant. That's everybody's sort of first key indicator of, right, is this even going to work from a daylight perspective, both in terms of the impacts outside and what we can build internally. Rights of light, because it is a bit more of a financial piece sometimes, and it's a property right and it's the legal element, that can be dealt with a bit separately. In terms of pitfalls, I think that the hardest thing architects have to do at the minute, it's when they're designing internally for their own spaces. If they're designing a block of apartments, they have to try and make sure that they can get the right mix of units and the right mix of spaces that have maybe got two windows that serve it, or dual aspect nature, or that it's not too deep and single aspect and things like that. So I think that's the hardest thing they have to do, because part of the BRE targets and all that kind of daylight and sunlight for planning stuff is about what you are achieving internally in your own building. And they can be quite high, those standards sometimes. And rightly so, we've got to make sure that people are going to be able to enjoy these spaces. But that's where we do a lot of our work with architects, and we'll do quite a lot of sample tests and things like that. So yeah, it's really good getting into we get into the design team at an early stage and speak to the architects, we have great fun and we design some really good stuff with them.
It's very on trend at the moment to build high rise. And I use that phrase on trend kind of tongue in cheek a little bit because there is a need that we have to build more properties in a smaller space. So the place to go is up, which is not just a London thing. It's growing in Manchester. The skyline in Manchester is really, really significantly changed. The same is happening where I live in Bristol. And I think it will happen across major cities across the country. How do you see that moving forward, specifically with rights to light, and then adding in the sustainability and ESG piece on top of that when you've got solar panels, and then the complexity maybe of retrofit with someone wanting to add a balcony or some form of skylight? What are things going to get simpler moving forward or more complex?
I really hope simpler. It feels when you pose the question, I could tell in your mind there was about 8 million things going on because it is complex. Firstly, the high-rise piece is interesting, and then it also feeds into that high-risk building piece and the Building Safety Act and all that kind of stuff. But to stick in my lane, the idea that would be great to get to, and maybe I'm thinking a bit philosophical here, would be if we could help to unlock some of this stuff for the developer and for, well, frankly, the people who are going to be living in those houses. You know, you don't want people waiting around. Developers are trying to develop. Government set housing targets. They're going to have to build some buildings, and they can't all be housing estates on greenfield sites. They just can't, because they've got their own problems too. You know, you're introducing a whole set of maybe cars and traffic that weren't there before and all that kind of good stuff. So in many ways, high rises in and around cities where you've already got transport, it makes the most sense. The rights of light piece, first of all, I'll stay on this left side for rights of light. If we can help to unlock things with that combination of using rights of light methodology plus the daylight and sunlight methodology, and we've got an interesting piece coming out on that soon, we can hopefully get people through planning, and B, without those holdups, or to help those holdups be eased and help mitigate them at an early stage. So I don't see it going away, and in a funny way, because of cases like this and cases like this Bankside loss one that's been in the press recently, and that's always a double-edged sword that it's in the press, because it helps people recognize it, but it also is going to alert a lot of people to it. You're going to have rights of light. Rights of light is going to be in the conversation. It's not going away, and it's not going to disappear. Hopefully, it can be managed better. I think that's the key message. The daylight piece is really interesting, and you touched on ESG stuff there, Darren. That again, slightly outside of my bracket, but it's something that Hollis have been doing more and more over the last few years, because we recognise that there's a need for it and a need to look at it. Interestingly, I think ESG is going to be not its own thing in the end. I think it's going to drip through everybody's workflow and everybody's separate section. It will have those elements of ESG, and maybe ESG will stop being, right, here's some ESG consultants who are going to tell you about this. It's going to actually drip through the whole thing, and it'll all get chopped up. So it was interesting. I was reading an article this morning about, well, there's a couple of things on solar I wanted to touch about. The first article was actually about how buildings in Europe are much more adept, and just generally towns and streets are more adept at dealing with this, these hot weather, these climate change events. And maybe they're not events, it's just climate change. It's just happening, and it's warmer. There was an article, and it was about Seville, and the way they deal with that is a lot of covered streets. I know that in Italy, a lot of the streets are narrow because it encourages shading in the hottest parts of the day. So it's actually, can we help to design our buildings with a bit more of a European mindset, where we're designing maybe a courtyard that's going to be shaded, or we've got houses that aren't south facing so that they aren't getting blasted with sun throughout the day. You know, it's funny, there's a juxtaposition in this, all of this. So the BRE guidance talks about how nice it is if you've got a south facing window. Yeah, great. We like the sun in our living rooms and whatever, that's great. What about when it's 40 degrees for 3 weeks on the trot in 20 years? I don't know how I don't know how useful that's gonna be. I know the flat where I live has a north-facing living room, and I go in it in the evening, and it's brilliant because it's nice and cool, and none of the room is been warmed by the sun throughout the day. Of course, you've got the winter, which is gonna, bring in different equations, but can we look at Europe and say, well, actually, yeah, they've been doing it for a while. Places in Seville, they've got lots of lovely shaded areas. They know what they're doing. Can we look at that instead of building in a more traditional British climate in our heads, where we think it's probably going to be about 25 degrees max? It's just not, is it, anymore? Solar panels, that's another interesting one. So 2 elements on solar panels. Hasn't really happened yet, but there's more solar panels going on, buildings going on everywhere, both residential and commercial. What happens when someone builds a lovely tall building right next to a solar panel, and that person's solar projection for their return on investment, for what energy they're getting back in, what they're returning to the grid, whatever, is that going to change materially if someone puts a big tower next to it, or even a couple of roof extensions or something like that? There was a couple of cases a few years ago. They ended up being more planning based, and there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a right to that panel. That panel doesn't act like a window in the way that a window acts in a rights of light sense. Can't see that changing immediately, but it might be more of a planning consideration, or even just a commercial negotiation between 2 owners. If you've got a large warehouse roof next door and you've covered it in PV, all the panels, and you're getting a great return, but then someone puts something just to the south of your building that's going to change it for the foreseeable, well, that's going to be an interesting conversation. And these are the types of things that I don't see yet from big institutional investors, developers. No one's really coming forward and thinking about those things. Our PV and solar team at Hollis, we're always talking about this and thinking, right, okay, how are we going to mitigate it, and what we're going to do, and how are we going to tell the client about this? Because actually, if they are planning a huge PV array, but actually in planning, there's already 2 large buildings to the south, well, there's no point in them spending hundreds of thousands of pounds putting large amounts of PV on this building if it's not going to get those returns. So either you can do something about it and speak to the neighbors, whatever, or you can just plan accordingly. The other piece of solar that I wanted to mention here was, and I'm sure you've come across these, Darren, the solar glare pieces. So solar glare is a really interesting topic, and it does feel like it is catching a bit of press at the minute. There was I don't know if you saw this story in Amsterdam, in Schiphol Airport.
I haven't. No.
So a PV farm, like a ground-mounted PV estate in Belgium over the border, was set up, and it's been generating its returns, doing its thing, and 78,000 panels. There's quite a few. So Schiphol Airport took these guys to a Dutch court and have been awarded, in their favour, the ability to tell these people to actually demolish these panels in this solar field, because there was 20 minutes consistent solar glare during March. So the pilots were coming into Schiphol, and they were experiencing all this glare. Now, I don't know if any studies were done. It sounds to me like they weren't. The owners of the solar field have said, well, we can mitigate this. Maybe we can put like a different film on the top of the panel. We could alter them. But the Dutch court weren't buying it and said, well, we kind of should have done this a while ago. So I guess there's 2 things there. There's, and we do these types of assessments and so that, we're all in that field. We all need to be using, the right software and the right tools and the right sort of mentality to advise our clients here. So there's a risk element, but also it's about, again, that early engagement, because you can just imagine if 2 years ago, 3 years ago, these people had a chat with each other and said, right, look, guys, we're going to put this field here. Yeah. What do you think? And from what I've read so far, the panels that they chose, panels are designed to absorb light rather than reflect it, but there's different panels, again, slightly outside of my expertise, but these ones are apparently more reflective than a darker panel would have been.
Okay.
And therefore, you've got this sort of this glare going into these pilots' eyes, which, again, there's a bit of an irony there that you've got this sort of green energy producing field, and then, a more typical polluter in an airport. But I think this is more about safety.
I think it's more about lives, isn't it? It sounds like from what you're saying. And you could argue that the pilots don't need a view out of the window to be able to land the aircraft, which is true, but it's still off-putting, and it puts people's lives at risk.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the most, I think takeoff is the most, but landing is the second most dangerous part of the flight process.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, because they wouldn't have maybe taken into consideration the flight path and the altitude that they would have been at that particular time. And I'm not sure you guys use IES software, I guess. Yeah.
Not for solar actually. There's a couple of other softwares that we use,
Okay.
but yeah.
But I'm not sure that is built in the modeling program.
In IES, I don't think it is, but the others.
So which one do you use then?
So there's two types. There's MBS, and then there's something else called, the company behind it is Forge Solar.
Okay.
So you can use those, and they effectively simulate the whole year.
Yes.
And all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah.
And you can calculate all the different angles. And again, it's about that engagement. If you speak to the aircraft people and the people at the airport, they will tell you what
The flight path.
the flight paths and which runways and all that kind of good stuff. So
Yeah. And I would imagine as well that they would be able to give you data on times and frequency of a particular runway that they're landing on or taking off from.
Oh yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. Going back to the point that you made with reference to ESG, sustainability, and that kind of being a bolt-on at some other point, most definitely that's what we found as a consultancy, is trying to just help the clients understand that if you include us at the beginning, we can then look at things more holistically and be involved instead of waiting a little bit further down the road. Or the other thing that I see as well is that in the ESG space, there's a propensity to get a junior person involved instead of leaving it with a senior person. So the quality of the advice all the way through the project is not at the same level. It will dip down, and then the senior person is then trying to get the junior person calculation, as it were, kind of out of trouble. I use that phrase. And so that's what we found, is to have that senior person all the way through just reduces the risk for the client, so that later on down the line we don't have a problem.
Yeah, or at least where there's regular touch points for that senior person to, we all know that the juniors in any industry need to
get experience.
You need to have a go.
Yeah.
But you're right, and we see it across all services really, and not necessarily in any specific one. But yeah, we like to have those touch points as well, because it helps people develop, and then it'll give them points to say, right, well, actually, the next stage is X, Y, Z. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But the late engagement is the killer, isn't it? That makes it tough for everybody.
Then I've also had a conversation with someone, and I'm interested to see how you see this in your consultancy, where the ESG thing is spread across, or say energy and sustainability is spread into the MEP package. So it's a bolt-on within MEP as opposed to it's its own entity. Had a conversation with someone today, and I'm like, look, you need to just have this as its own entity, spreading across everywhere, instead of a subset of an entity that has kind of maybe arguably been around for a lot longer.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We have our own separate piece, and then they effectively feed in and almost have oversight of all these other traditional services, because all the traditional services realize, well, actually, we need to start doing this, and that's why we've got that separate team. They do their own stuff, but yeah, they feed into all these other spaces, and it's interesting because this is what the clients want towards, as we all move forward. It's what clients need and what they're looking for, really.
So just going back now, just at the end of this conversation, to the rights of light and the courts and the way that the system is set up, that overlaid with the way that the world has changed and is continuing to change, that there is this need for us all to recognize that the way that we did things in the past is not going to work in its entirety moving forward.
Exactly right there, Darren. You've got some traditional methodologies which are still useful. You've got a traditional set of technology that's also still a bit useful. And we can all look back to the past and see examples of how that worked. But right now, what we need to do is use the innovations and the technology that we've all got to hand and that we all understand, combined with an understanding of the cultural change that's happened over the last 100 years or 50 years. If we can combine those two, that's where we're going to get a marrying up of human experience mixed with scientific and technological ability.
Most definitely. And I think that the more that we can embrace that, then the better the buildings will be for the people that they're being built for. And one of the things that I'm talking more frequently to my clients and to my own team about is that these buildings are built for people. And that's what we need to put higher on the priority list. If you think about the most significant experiences that you have in your life, they're generally in a building. Births, deaths, last moments that you have with someone, maybe proposals, maybe parties, all of these different events, learning, connecting with people. These are all generally happen in buildings,
Yeah.
developing a talent. And that's what we need to have in the forefront of our minds instead of treating buildings as just a money machine.
I couldn't agree more. You have so much experience in buildings. Yes, there's some great ones outdoors as well, but a lot of those amazing things that you do in life are in the buildings. What we can all get caught up a bit in is, what do the targets say? How do we get this through planning? How do we work the system? How do we make it do this? And we all get really caught up in that. Going back to the European stuff, and that's something that our European teams look at. We look at how we're going to design these buildings that are actually enjoyable for the people to use, because that's the key part. We're going to be in them. Let's enjoy them.
Good. Barney, it's been great having you on the podcast. Really appreciate your wisdom, your passion, and your experience.
Thanks, Dan. Been brilliant to have you.
Thanks for watching to the end. I think that you'll like this, but before you do that, just make sure that you've commented and liked below, and also that you've subscribed.